He was the family failure, mocked for choosing mountains over money, solitude over status. But when his father's will gave him nothing but a crumbling stone fortress, while his siblings inherited millions, they didn't know that the last laugh would be his, because hidden beneath those ancient walls was $267 million, and a truth about his family's betrayal that would destroy them all. Before we explore this story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The morning fog clung to the ridgeline like a living thing, thick and patient, as Marcus Hayden split wood behind his cabin. Each swing of the axe was precise, economical, the kind of motion that came from 20 years of living alone in the Montana wilderness. His hands were calloused, his face weathered by sun and wind, and at 43, he looked like a man carved from the same granite peaks that surrounded him. The air smelled of pine, resin and wood smoke, clean and sharp, the way it always did in the high country during late September. He had built this life deliberately, piece by piece, log by log. The cabin wasn't much, just 800 square feet of hand-hewn timber and stone, but it was his. No mortgage, no neighbors, no expectations. Just Marcus, the mountains, and the kind of silence that most people would find unbearable. He found it honest. The mountains didn't lie. They didn't judge. They didn't compare you to your brothers and find you lacking. His phone, an old flip model that barely got reception up here, sat on the porch railing where he'd left it 3 days ago. He only checked it once a week, usually on Sundays, when he drove down to Timber Ridge for supplies. But today was Wednesday, and something made him glance at it as he stacked another cord of wood against the cabin wall. The screen showed 7 missed calls, all from his sister, Victoria. Marcus wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand and stared at the device like it was a rattlesnake. Victoria hadn't called him in 4 years, not since their mother's funeral, when she'd made it crystal clear that Marcus's presence was an embarrassment to the family. He'd worn his only suit, 20 years old and slightly too small, and she'd looked at him like he'd tracked mud across a white carpet. He picked up the phone and dialed voicemail. Victoria's voice came through, clipped and cold as always. "Marcus, it's Victoria. Father died 3 days ago. Funeral is Saturday at 2. Rosewood Cemetery. The lawyer wants to see you Monday at 10. Don't be late for once in your life." Marcus set the phone down slowly. He walked to the edge of the porch and looked out over the valley below, where autumn was beginning to paint the aspens gold. His father was dead. Richard Hayden, the titan of Hayden Industries, the man who'd built a manufacturing empire from a single machine shop, the man who'd looked at his youngest son, 23 years ago, and said, "If you walk away from this family, don't expect to come crawling back." Marcus hadn't crawled back. He'd never looked back at all, until now. He sat down on the porch steps, elbows on his knees, and let the memories wash over him. Growing up in the Hayden house had been like living in a museum dedicated to success. His father had built everything from nothing, pulling himself up from poverty through sheer will and ruthless business sense. By the time Marcus was born, the youngest of 4 children, Hayden Industries employed 3,000 people across 6 states and generated revenues that made the local newspapers write glowing profiles every quarter. His older brother, Richard Jr., everyone called him RJ, had been groomed from birth to take over the empire. He was sharp, ambitious, everything their father wanted in an heir. His sister, Victoria, 8 years older than Marcus, had married into old money and sat on the boards of 6 charitable foundations, the kind that threw galas and named wings of hospitals after donors. His other brother, Thomas, had become a corporate attorney, specializing in mergers and acquisitions, handling deals worth hundreds of millions. And then there was Marcus, the mistake, the afterthought, the one who didn't fit. While his siblings talked about quarterly earnings and market shares over dinner, Marcus had been more interested in how things were built, not bought. He'd spent his teenage years in the company workshop, learning from the machinists and welders, understanding metal and mechanics, in ways his father found embarrassingly blue-collar. When Marcus was 20, his father had given him an ultimatum: go to business school, join the company in a real capacity, or get out. Marcus had gotten out. He'd taken the $2,000 he'd saved working summer jobs, bought a beat-up truck, and driven west until the roads turned to dirt and the towns disappeared behind him. He'd worked as a ranch hand, a hunting guide, a carpenter, anything that kept him in the mountains and away from boardrooms. He'd built his cabin with his own hands over 3 years, hauling every stone from the creek bed, cutting every log from trees he'd felled himself. His family had called it running away. Marcus called it running towards something real. They'd stopped talking to him after the first 5 years, except for the occasional Christmas card from his mother, with a note that always said the same thing: "We miss you. Please come home." He never did. His mother had died 4 years ago, and even then, he'd only stayed for the funeral service itself, leaving before the reception, before the small talk and the pitying looks, and Victoria's sharp comments about his worn boots. Now, his father was gone, too. Marcus felt something twist in his chest. Not quite grief, more like the phantom pain of a limb that had been amputated long ago. He'd made peace with his choices decades ago, but there was still a small part of him, buried deep, that had wanted his father to understand, to maybe, just once, say that Marcus's life had value, even if it wasn't measured in dollars and contracts. That night, Marcus lay in bed, listening to the wind move through the pines, and thinking about Monday. The lawyer wanted to see him. That meant there was something in the will. Probably a token amount, $10,000 maybe, or some piece of furniture nobody else wanted. His father's way of saying, "See, I didn't forget you," while still making it clear exactly how little Marcus mattered. Saturday arrived gray and cold. Marcus drove the 4 hours to Millbrook in his old truck, the same one he'd bought 23 years ago, held together now with more welds and replacement parts than original metal. The town looked the same, prosperous and pristine, with its brick storefronts and manicured parks. The Hayden name was everywhere: Hayden Park, the Hayden Community Center, Hayden Hall at the university. His father's legacy, carved into the landscape like a monument. The funeral was exactly what Marcus expected. 200 people in expensive clothes, speaking in hushed tones about what a great man Richard Hayden had been, how he'd built an empire, how he'd employed so many, how generous he'd been. Marcus stood in the back, wearing the same 20-year-old suit, feeling like an intruder at someone else's memorial. RJ gave the eulogy, his voice strong and confident, talking about leadership and vision and the American dream. Victoria dabbed at her eyes with a silk handkerchief, her diamond rings catching the light from the stained glass windows. Thomas stood straight-backed and somber, every inch the successful attorney. None of them acknowledged Marcus's presence. After the service, as people filed past the casket, Marcus waited until the crowd had thinned. He approached slowly, looking down at his father's face, peaceful in death, in a way it never had been in life. Richard Hayden had been a hard man, driven by demons Marcus had never understood. Even now, dressed in his finest suit, hands folded over his chest, he looked like he was still calculating, still planning his next move. "You should have called him," a voice said beside Marcus. He turned to see Victoria, her expression as cold as her voice. "He asked about you, near the end. Wanted to know if you were still alive up in your little mountain hideaway." Marcus didn't respond. What was there to say? Victoria shook her head. "Monday, at 10. Don't embarrass us by being late." She walked away, her heels clicking on the marble floor, leaving Marcus alone with the man who'd never understood why anyone would choose trees over treasure. Monday morning, Marcus showed up at the offices of Morrison, Price and Associates, at 9:45. The law firm occupied the top 3 floors of Millbrook's tallest building, all glass and steel and breathtaking views. The receptionist seemed surprised when he gave his name, like she couldn't quite believe this weather-beaten man in worn jeans and a clean button-down shirt was actually a Hayden. The conference room was intimidating, all dark wood and leather chairs, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. His siblings were already there. RJ sat at one end of the long table, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Marcus's truck. Victoria was beside him, perfectly coiffed, examining her manicured nails. Thomas was reviewing documents, making notes in the margins with an expensive pen. They all looked up when Marcus entered. RJ's expression was neutral, carefully controlled. Victoria's lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. Thomas just nodded once, then returned to his documents. Marcus took a seat at the opposite end of the table, as far from them as possible. The silence stretched out, uncomfortable and heavy, until the door opened and an elderly man in wire-rimmed glasses entered. "Good morning. I'm Howard Morrison," he said, settling into a chair at the head of the table. "I've been your father's attorney for 32 years. First, let me express my condolences. Richard was a remarkable man." He opened a leather portfolio and extracted a thick document. "As you know, we're here to review Richard's last will and testament. I'll summarize the key points, though you'll each receive a full copy." Morrison cleared his throat and began reading. RJ would inherit controlling interest in Hayden Industries, 60% of the shares, along with the primary family estate, valued at $12 million. Victoria would receive 20% of the company shares and the vacation home in Aspen, valued at $8 million, plus her mother's jewelry collection. Thomas would receive 15% of the shares and the family's investment portfolio, worth approximately $18 million. Marcus listened to the numbers with detachment. Millions upon millions, divided up like pieces of a pie. His father had been wealthier than Marcus had imagined. The reading continued. Various charitable bequests, provisions for long-time employees, specific items for friends and business associates. And then Morrison turned to the last page. "And to my youngest son, Marcus William Hayden," Morrison read, his voice careful, "I leave the old fortress property in the Bitterroot Range, including all structures, land, and contents therein. The property consists of approximately 80 acres, and the stone structure built by my father, Jonathan Hayden, in 1938. Silence filled the room. Then Victoria laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "The old fortress? That crumbling pile of rocks grandfather built during the Depression? You've got to be kidding." RJ's expression shifted to something almost like pity. "Well, Marcus, at least you got something. Though I'm not sure what you're supposed to do with it. The place has been falling apart for 60 years. Thomas didn't look up from his documents. "Property taxes are probably more than it's worth. You might want to just deed it back to the estate." Marcus felt heat rising in his chest. The old familiar anger. Even now, even in death, his father was sending a message. "Here's your inheritance, son. A worthless ruin. A reminder that you chose to walk away from everything that mattered. While your siblings get millions, you get a pile of rocks in the middle of nowhere." Morrison cleared his throat uncomfortably. "There is one additional provision. Marcus, your father left a sealed letter for you, to be delivered with the property deed." He slid an envelope across the table, yellowed with age. Marcus's name, written in his father's precise handwriting. Victoria stood up, smoothing her skirt. "Well, if that's everything, Howard, I have a board meeting at noon." She glanced at Marcus one last time, her expression a mixture of disdain and something that might have been satisfaction. "Enjoy your fortress, little brother. Try not to get crushed when it finally collapses." RJ and Thomas gathered their documents and followed her out without another word to Marcus. Just like that. It was over. The great Richard Hayden's fortune, divided and distributed, and Marcus was left with exactly what his family thought he deserved. Nothing of value. Morrison waited until they were alone, then spoke quietly. Your father added that provision to his will 18 months ago. The letter, he wrote it himself, sealed it, and asked me to keep it with the deed. He was very specific that you should receive both together. Marcus picked up the envelope, feeling its weight. Do you know what's in the letter? No, I was never told. But I will say this, Marcus. Your father spoke about you more than you might think, especially toward the end. Morrison stood and offered his hand. The deed and all relevant property documents are in this folder. The fortress is yours, free and clear. No mortgage, no liens. Whatever you choose to do with it, it's your decision. Marcus shook his hand, took the folder, and walked out of that glass tower into the bright autumn morning. He sat in his truck for a long time, staring at the envelope. Finally, he opened it. His father's handwriting filled 2 pages, the script shaky in places, written by a hand that knew it was running out of time. Marcus, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're probably angry. You have every right to be. I gave you a pile of rocks, while your siblings got fortunes. They'll laugh at you, just like they always have. Let them. The fortress isn't what they think it is. Your grandfather built it for a reason, and I've kept that reason safe for 70 years. I never told your siblings, because they never would have understood. But you might. You're the only one who ever valued what's built over what's bought. Go to the fortress, not as my son, but as your grandfather's grandson. There's more there than stone and mortar. Search carefully. Remember, the strongest walls hide the deepest secrets. You'll know what to do when you find it. If I failed you as a father, and I know I did, perhaps I can at least give you this, the truth about where we really came from and what we really built our fortune on. It wasn't just hard work and business sense, Marcus. It was sacrifice and blood and one man's desperate gamble during the darkest days of the Depression. Your grandfather saved this family. I protected his secret. Now it's yours to do with as you see fit. I'm sorry I never told you I was proud of you. I'm sorry I let you think you didn't matter. You mattered more than you ever knew. Richard. Marcus read the letter 3 times, his hands trembling slightly. Search carefully. Deepest secrets. What was his father talking about? The fortress had always been just a strange family relic. A stone building his grandfather had constructed in the mountains for reasons no one quite understood. Jonathan Hayden had been an engineer, brilliant but eccentric, who'd made and lost several fortunes before the Depression hit. The family story was that he'd built the fortress as a retreat, a place to escape the chaos of the collapsing economy. But there was something in his father's words, an urgency, a weight that suggested something more. Marcus started the truck and headed west, out of Millbrook, away from the glass towers and manicured parks, toward the mountains. The drive took 6 hours, following highways that became state routes that became county roads that finally dissolved into rough tracks, marked only by faded wooden signs. The fortress sat in a narrow valley, surrounded by steep granite walls, accessible only by a single overgrown road that wound through dense pine forest. Marcus had been here exactly 3 times in his life. Once as a child of 7, once as a teenager of 16, and once more at 20, right before he'd left the family for good. Each time, the place had seemed strange and slightly ominous. A massive stone structure that didn't belong in the wilderness, built with walls 3 feet thick and narrow windows that looked more like defensive positions than sources of light. As his truck rounded the final bend, the fortress came into view. It was bigger than he remembered, a 2-story rectangular structure built from blocks of native granite, weathered gray by decades of mountain weather. The roof was slate, much of it missing or cracked. Wooden shutters hung crooked on rusted hinges. Weeds had taken over what had once been a courtyard. The whole place looked like it was slowly being reclaimed by the forest. Nature, patient and persistent in its work of erasure. Marcus parked and stepped out into the cool afternoon air. The silence here was different from the silence at his cabin. Heavier, somehow. Expectant. He approached the main door, a massive slab of oak reinforced with iron bands. The key from Morrison's folder was old-fashioned, ornate, the kind they didn't make anymore. It slid into the lock with surprising smoothness, and the door swung open with only a faint groan of protest. The interior was dark and musty, smelling of old stone and dry rot. Marcus's flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing a large main hall with a vaulted ceiling. Dust covered everything in a thick blanket. Animal droppings dotted the floor, evidence that mice and pack rats had made this place home for years. But underneath the decay, he could see the craftsmanship, the massive hand-hewn beams, the carefully fitted stonework, the attention to detail that spoke of serious engineering. To the left was what had probably been a living area, with a stone fireplace large enough to stand in. To the right, a dining space with a long wooden table still standing, though one end had collapsed. Straight ahead, a staircase led up to the second floor. Marcus began his exploration methodically, checking each room, looking for he didn't know what. Clues, hidden compartments. He felt ridiculous, like a child playing treasure hunter. The second floor had been divided into 6 small rooms, probably bedrooms or offices. All were empty now except for broken furniture and decades of accumulated debris. The windows offered views of the surrounding valley, spectacular vistas of pine-covered slopes and distant peaks. Marcus could see why his grandfather had chosen this spot. Remote and beautiful. Defensible if that had been a concern. He spent the rest of the afternoon exploring, taking notes, trying to understand the structure. The fortress had been built solid, meant to last. The walls showed no structural damage despite 70 years of neglect. The foundation was rock solid, literally carved from the granite bedrock. The roof needed work, certainly, but the basic bones of the building were sound. It was actually, Marcus realized with surprise, a remarkable piece of construction, especially for having been built in 1938, with limited resources and equipment. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the narrow windows, Marcus found himself back in the main hall. He stood in the center of the space, slowly turning, trying to see what his father had wanted him to see. Search carefully, the letter had said. The strongest walls hide the deepest secrets. Marcus walked the perimeter of the hall, running his hands along the stone walls, tapping occasionally, listening for hollow spaces. Nothing. He examined the fireplace, checking for hidden catches or movable stones, the kind of thing you saw in movies. Nothing. He checked the floor, looking for trapdoors or unusual seams in the stone. Still nothing. Frustration began to build. What was he supposed to find? Maybe his father had been losing his mind at the end, seeing significance in what was just an old building. But something kept Marcus searching. His father had been many things, hard and cold and unforgiving, but he'd never been foolish, and he'd never been prone to fantasy. If he said there was something here, there was something here. Marcus climbed the stairs again, this time moving more slowly, paying attention to each step. The staircase was stone, built into the wall itself, rising in a gentle curve to the second floor. Solid, immovable, permanent. On the 7th step from the bottom, his boot caught on something. He looked down and saw a slight irregularity in the stone, barely visible, a tiny gap where the step met the wall. He knelt and ran his fingers along it. Not a crack from settling, but a seam, perfectly straight, deliberately cut. His heart began to beat faster. He pulled out his pocket knife and carefully worked the blade into the seam. Something clicked, so softly he almost missed it. And then, with a grinding sound of stone on stone, the entire section of wall beside the staircase began to move. It swung inward slowly, ponderously, revealing darkness beyond. Marcus's hands shook as he aimed his flashlight into the opening. Stone. Steps led down, disappearing into absolute blackness beneath the fortress. A hidden staircase, built into the structure itself, concealed for 70 years behind stone and silence and secrets. Marcus stood at the threshold of the hidden passage, his flashlight beam swallowed by the darkness below. His mouth was dry. His grandfather had built this, had hidden it, had told no one, or had only told his son, Marcus's father, who had kept the secret for his entire life. Why? What was down there that required such elaborate concealment? The strongest walls hide the deepest secrets, his father had written. He descended carefully, testing each step before putting his full weight on it. The air grew colder as he went down, and damper. The walls here were the same carefully fitted stone as above, but smoother, and there were marks on them, chisel marks, the signatures of hand tools and hard labor. His grandfather had carved this passage from solid rock. How long had it taken? How had he done to it without anyone knowing? The passage led down perhaps 30 feet, then leveled off into a corridor that stretched ahead into darkness. Marcus's light revealed more stonework, more careful engineering. This wasn't a rough tunnel hastily dug. This was architecture, planned and executed with precision. The corridor ended at another door, this one made of steel, spotted with rust but still solid. There was no lock, just a wheel-style handle like you'd find on a ship's bulkhead. Marcus gripped it and pulled. It didn't budge. He tried again, putting his full weight into it. Nothing. 70 years of rust had seized it completely. He'd need tools, penetrating oil, maybe a torch. But it was here, a sealed chamber beneath the fortress. And beyond that door was whatever his grandfather had hidden, whatever had been worth building a fortress to protect. Marcus sat down on the stone floor, his back against the cold wall, and let out a long breath. His family had given him garbage, or so they thought, a worthless pile of rocks, a punchline to the joke of his inheritance. But they were wrong. His father had known they were wrong, and tomorrow Marcus would find out what, exactly, had been hidden beneath the mountains for 70 years, while his family built their empire on top of a secret they never knew existed. Marcus didn't sleep that night. He drove back to his cabin in darkness, his mind racing with possibilities and questions. What had his grandfather hidden? Why had his father protected the secret? And why, after all these years of silence and rejection, had his father chosen to give this to Marcus instead of RJ or Victoria or Thomas? The letter had said Marcus was the only one who would understand, the only one who valued what was built over what was bought. But understand what? By first light, Marcus was loading his truck with everything he'd need: a generator, work lights, his full complement of tools, bolt cutters, a cutting torch, penetrating oil, pry bars, sledgehammers. If that steel door didn't want to open, he'd convince it. He also packed food, water, a sleeping bag, and camping gear. He had a feeling he'd be spending more than a few days at the fortress. The drive back seemed longer in daylight, the rough road jarring his spine with every pothole and washout. When he arrived, the fortress looked different somehow, less ominous, more purposeful. It wasn't a ruin. It was a vault. His grandfather had built this place to last, to protect, to keep secrets safe from a world that Jonathan Hayden clearly hadn't trusted. Marcus spent the first full day just setting up. He hauled the generator inside, strung work lights through the main hall and up the staircase. With proper lighting, the fortress revealed itself more clearly. The stonework was extraordinary, each block precisely cut and fitted without mortar in many places, just the weight and friction of stone on stone holding everything together. the kind of masonry you saw in ancient castles, techniques that had been old when America was young. He found evidence of his grandfather's presence everywhere once he started looking. Initials carved into beams, J. 1938. Tool marks on the stone that matched specific chisels. And in one of the second-floor rooms, hidden behind a collapsed bookshelf, Marcus found the first real clue. A leather-bound journal, water-stained and brittle, but readable. The journal was dated 1937 to 1939, and it was written in his grandfather's cramped, precise handwriting. Marcus sat on the dusty floor, carefully turning pages, reading by the light of his work lamp. Jonathan Hayden had started the journal the day he'd purchased the land, 80 acres of mountain wilderness for $300, a fortune during the Depression, but cheap for what would come. August 4, 1937. The first entry read, "I have acquired the land, remote, defensible, with good water and stone, for building. No one will think to look here. No one will understand what I'm doing until it's done, and by then it will be too late to stop me. I've lost everything twice in my life. I won't lose it a third time. This time, I'll build something that can't be taken away by markets or banks or the greed of lesser men." The entries continued, documenting the construction process. Jonathan had done most of the work himself, occasionally hiring local men for the heaviest labor, but never letting them see the full scope of what he was building. He'd been methodical, obsessive even, working through winters that would have killed most men, living in a tent on site, hauling stone from the creek bed, and cutting lumber from the surrounding forest. November 22, 1937. One entry read, "The walls are 8 feet high now, strong enough to hold back anything. I've begun the foundation work for the lower chamber. This is where it will all rest. My life's work, my redemption, my revenge against everyone who said I was finished." Lower chamber. Marcus's pulse quickened. He flipped through more pages, reading about the construction of the hidden passage, the secret door, the elaborate concealment mechanisms. His grandfather had been brilliant, designing the trigger stone on the 7th step, creating a counterweight system that would last decades. But why? What required such secrecy? March 15, 1938. Another entry. "The chamber is complete. 40 feet by 60 feet, carved from solid granite. The walls are smooth. The air circulation system works perfectly. Temperature stable, humidity controlled. It's perfect. Now, I just need to fill it. The next 6 months will determine everything." Marcus searched through the rest of the journal, but the entries became sparse after that, mostly brief notes about maintenance and supplies. Nothing about what, exactly, Jonathan had put in the chamber. The journal ended abruptly in November of 1939 with a single line, "It's done. The family is safe. Richard knows, but no one else must ever know until the time is right." Richard knows. His father had known from the beginning, had probably been here, had probably seen whatever was hidden below, and he'd kept the secret for his entire life, even as Hayden Industries grew into an empire, even as the family accumulated wealth beyond imagination. Why? What could possibly be worth such long silence? Marcus spent the next 2 days working on the fortress itself, partly to give himself time to think, and partly because the building needed it. He patched the worst holes in the roof, using tarps and salvaged slate. He cleared debris from the main hall, swept decades of dust and animal droppings. He repaired shutters and reinforced the front door. The work was familiar, comforting even, the simple satisfaction of fixing things with his hands. As he worked, he found more traces of his grandfather's presence. In the dining area, beneath layers of grime, he discovered intricate carvings on the wooden table, geometric patterns that seemed almost mystical. On the second floor, in what had probably been Jonathan's personal quarters, Marcus found a small alcove with shelves still holding books. technical manuals on engineering, volumes on metallurgy, texts about banking and finance from the 1920s. His grandfather had been studying, preparing, understanding exactly what he was doing. Behind one of the books, Marcus discovered a folded blueprint, yellowed and fragile. He carefully spread it out on the floor. It was a complete architectural plan of the fortress, including detailed schematics of the hidden chamber below. The level of detail was astonishing. Ventilation shafts disguised as decorative elements, drainage systems, even emergency exits that Marcus hadn't yet discovered. His grandfather had thought of everything, planned for every contingency. This wasn't just a hiding place. It was a fortress in every sense of the word. But his mind never left that steel door. He found 2 more journals hidden in various places throughout the fortress, both from later periods, one from 1954 to 1961, documenting Jonathan's periodic visits to check on his creation. Always alone, always secretive. The entries spoke of inventory maintenance and security verification, but never revealed what was being maintained or secured. In this journal, Marcus found something that made his stomach turn. His grandfather had written about teaching his son, Marcus's father Richard, about the chamber. June 12, 1956. One entry read, "Brought Richard today. He's 24 now, old enough to understand. Showed him everything. The acquisition records, the conversion process, the long-term strategy. He was shocked at first, asked if what I'd done was legal. I told him, legality and morality are luxuries of the comfortable. When the world is ending, you do what you must to survive. He's beginning to understand. He'll protect this. He has to, because his entire future depends on it." Marcus felt a chill reading those words. His father had been 24, younger than Marcus when he'd left the family, and he'd been brought into this secret, this burden. Had he wanted to know? Had he tried to refuse? The journal didn't say. It only documented that Richard had accepted his role as guardian of the family's hidden fortune. The third journal was from 1968 to 1972, the last years of Jonathan's life. The handwriting was shakier, the entries shorter. "Richard understands now why I did this," one entry read. "He's seen it all. He's agreed to protect it. He's stronger than I was. He won't let fear or greed corrupt the purpose. When the time is right, he'll know what to do." Marcus paused on that entry. When the time is right. His father had spent 43 years protecting this secret, waiting for the right time, and apparently, the right time was now, after his death. And the right person was Marcus, not RJ, who would have immediately liquidated everything and added it to the corporate assets. Not Victoria, who would have used it to climb even higher in society. Not Thomas, who would have seen it only as a legal problem to be managed. Marcus, the one who'd rejected the family and everything it stood for. The final entry, dated March 3, 1972, just weeks before Jonathan's death from a heart attack at age 78. "I've lived long enough to see it work. The empire Richard built, it stands on foundations I laid. Not the foundations, he thinks, not the machine shop, or the patents, or the business deals. The real foundation, the one that made everything else possible. It rests 40 feet below the mountains, hidden and protected. One day, someone will understand. Someone will see that survival sometimes requires doing what others are too weak or too moral to do. I regret nothing." Marcus set the journal down, his hands trembling slightly. His grandfather's words carried a weight that made him uneasy. Survival sometimes requires doing what others are too weak or too moral to do. What had Jonathan Hayden done? What secret had been worth a lifetime of concealment? He spent the evening in the main hall, sitting by a fire he'd built in the massive hearth, thinking about his family. His grandfather, ruthless and calculating. His father, burdened with knowledge he couldn't share. And his siblings, living their comfortable lives, completely unaware that their wealth came from suffering they'd never acknowledged. Marcus felt like he was standing at the intersection of 3 generations of choices, and whatever he did next would define what the Hayden name really meant. On the morning of the 4th day, Marcus gathered his tools and descended the hidden staircase once more. The work lights he'd strung through the passage cast harsh shadows on the stone walls. The steel door waited at the end, patient and immovable. He started with penetrating oil, soaking the wheel mechanism, letting chemistry and time work where brute force had failed. He waited 2 hours, then tried the wheel again. It moved, just a fraction of an inch, but it moved. Encouraged, Marcus applied more oil, then attached a pipe to the wheel for leverage. He pulled with everything he had. The wheel groaned, metal scraping against rust and corrosion. Another inch. Another. Sweat poured down his face despite the cool underground air. The wheel was turning now, slowly, grudgingly, but turning. 10 minutes of sustained effort, and finally, Marcus felt something release. The door's locking mechanism had disengaged. He stepped back, breathing hard, and gripped the door's edge. It was heavy, incredibly heavy, probably 3 inches of solid steel, but the hinges, though rusted, still functioned. The door swung outward, with a deep groan that echoed through the passage. Stale. Air rushed out, cool and dry. Marcus raised his flashlight and stepped through the threshold. The beam of light swept across a space so vast it took his breath away. The chamber was exactly as his grandfather had described, 40 feet wide, 60 feet long, carved from solid granite. But it wasn't empty. Far from it. The floor was lined with rows of wooden crates, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Metal shelving units stood against the walls, stacked with boxes and containers. Filing cabinets lined one entire side, and in the center of the room, on specially constructed platforms, sat objects covered with heavy canvas tarps. Marcus moved forward slowly, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. He approached the nearest crate and saw it was marked with stenciled letters, U.S. Treasury. His heart began to pound. He found a pry bar and carefully opened the crate. Inside, wrapped in oiled paper, were bricks of currency. Not modern bills, but old ones, from the 1920s and 30s. $100 bills, $1,000 bills, denominations that didn't even exist anymore. The entire crate was full of them. Marcus backed away, his mind reeling. He opened another crate. More currency, these from the 1940s. Another crate. Gold coins, thousands of them. American eagles and double eagles, Swiss francs, British sovereigns. Another. Bearer bonds, negotiable securities, each one worth thousands or tens of thousands of dollars. Another. Silver bars, stamped with assay marks and dates from the 1930s. What Marcus discovers behind that steel door will shatter everything he thought he knew about his family, expose a betrayal that spans generations, and prove that sometimes the greatest fortunes are hidden in the places everyone else ignores. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. He moved through the chamber like a man in a dream, opening crates, examining contents, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold his flashlight. Precious metals, rare coins, antiquities, artwork rolled in protective tubes, stock certificates from companies that had survived the Depression, companies that were now worth billions, gemstones in velvet-lined boxes, documents in fireproof safes. Marcus found himself stopping at one particular crate that was different from the others. It was smaller, more carefully sealed, and marked with a simple J.H. Personal. Inside, wrapped in silk cloth, were items that told a more intimate story. A collection of photographs showing a younger Jonathan Hayden, dressed impeccably, standing in front of various banks and businesses across America. In each photo, he looked confident, predatory, almost. These weren't casual snapshots. They were documentation, proof of his presence at the scene of each acquisition. Beneath the photographs, Marcus found correspondence, letters from desperate businessmen, from widows trying to sell family, heirlooms, from bankers trying to liquidate failed institutions, and Jonathan's responses were all the same: polite, professional, offering prices that were technically fair in the collapsed economy, but represented a fraction of true value. "Dear Mrs. Morrison," one letter read, "I understand. Your situation is dire. I can offer $1,200 for the complete contents of your late husband's estate. I know this seems insufficient, but in these difficult times, cash is scarce. I can complete the transaction within 48 hours. Respectfully, J. Hayden." $1,200 for an estate that included artwork, jewelry, and furnishings worth tens of thousands. But Mrs. Morrison probably had no choice. She needed cash immediately, and Jonathan Hayden had cash when no one else did. Marcus felt sick reading letter after letter, seeing the pattern repeat. His grandfather hadn't stolen. Not technically. He'd simply been there with money when desperate people had none, and he'd taken full advantage. Against the far wall, Marcus found something that made him stop cold. Photographs, hundreds of them, pinned to a corkboard. They showed banks, warehouses, mansions, businesses. Each photo had notes attached. Cleveland, March 1931. Chicago, June 1932. New York, October 1933. And beside each location, a number, amounts, huge amounts. Understanding began to dawn, cold and terrible. The depression, the bank failures, the panic, people losing everything. And his grandfather somehow had been there, had been acquiring, not buying, Marcus realized with a sick feeling, taking, exploiting the chaos, being the vulture while others starved. The dates matched perfectly. 1929 through 1936, the worst years of the economic collapse. Jonathan Hayden had somehow positioned himself to profit from catastrophe on a scale that was almost incomprehensible. Marcus found filing cabinets full of documents, foreclosure notices, bankruptcy papers, estate liquidations, all acquired for pennies on the dollar, purchased from desperate people who had no choice but to sell or lose everything. His grandfather had been methodical, patient, ruthless. He'd bought up assets when no one else had capital, when banks were failing and the economy was in free fall. And then he'd hidden it all here, in this underground vault, and waited. Waited for what? Marcus found the answer in another set of documents. These dated from the 1950s and 60s. Sale records. His grandfather had slowly, carefully, begun liquidating the hoard, selling pieces to collectors, to museums, to investors, never too much at once, never drawing attention, but steadily converting the Depression-era acquisitions into cash and investments. And that cash had funded something Marcus recognized: the founding and expansion of Hayden Industries, the machine shop his father had supposedly built from nothing, funded by gold coins acquired during bank failures, the patents that had made the family fortune, purchased with money from foreclosed estates, the expansion into manufacturing, financed by Depression-era bearer bonds. The entire Hayden empire, the whole glittering edifice of success and wealth and respectability, it had been built on this. On his grandfather's cold-blooded exploitation of the greatest economic disaster in American history. Marcus sat down hard on one of the crates, his legs suddenly weak, his family's fortune, the money that had paid for RJ's education, Victoria's society wedding, Thomas's law school, the mansions and the cars and the political connections, all of it had come from here, from suffering, from desperation, from people who'd lost everything while Jonathan Hayden had circled like a shark, buying up the wreckage of their lives. But there was more. Marcus forced himself to keep exploring, to see all of it. In the back corner of the chamber, he found something that made his blood run cold. Personal items, wedding rings, pocket watches, photograph albums, children's toys. Things people wouldn't have sold unless they were absolutely desperate, unless they had no other choice. His grandfather had taken these things, had kept them like trophies. One box contained dozens of wedding bands, each one carefully tagged with a name and date. Sarah Mitchell, Detroit, April 1932. Robert Chen, San Francisco, August 1933. Emma Rodriguez, Los Angeles, December 1934. Marcus picked up one of the rings, a simple gold band, worn thin from years of wear. Someone had loved this ring enough to marry in it, to wear it every day, to make it part of their identity. And then they'd been forced to sell it to Jonathan Hayden for probably $5 or $10 just to buy food or pay rent for another month. And next to these items, Marcus found journals. Not his grandfather's this time, but ledgers, account books. Each entry documented an acquisition. Gold pocket watch, 18 karat, acquired from James Morrison, Detroit, March 15, 1932. Paid $12, worth approximately $200. Diamond engagement ring, 1.5 carats, acquired from Sarah Chen, San Francisco, June 4, 1933. Paid $35, worth approximately $800. Page after page. Hundreds of entries, thousands of transactions. Each one a small tragedy. A family's heirloom sold for a fraction of its worth to a man who knew exactly what he was buying and exactly how desperate the sellers were. Marcus felt sick. He wanted to close the ledgers, to unsee what he'd read, but he couldn't stop. He kept turning pages, kept reading, kept understanding more deeply what his family's wealth really represented. Near the back of one ledger, he found an entry that made him stop. Complete contents of Morrison Family Estate, Chicago, November 9, 1934. Paid $2,300. Estate value, approximately $150,000. Family deceased, suicide. Suicide. Marcus closed his eyes. His grandfather had known what his bargain hunting was doing to people, had known and hadn't cared, had simply calculated the numbers and made the deals and built his hidden vault. And then he'd used that fortune to create a legitimate business, to give his son, Marcus's father, a foundation to build an empire that looked clean and respectable but was rooted in exploitation and suffering. In another section of the chamber, Marcus discovered something that added another layer to the story. There were newspaper clippings carefully preserved in acid-free folders. Headlines from the Depression years. Thousands line up for bread. Banks close. Depositors lose life savings. Suicide rate soars as economy collapses. And beside each clipping, his grandfather had made notes. Chicago banks failed. Opportunity in estate. Liquidations. Detroit manufacturing collapse. Acquire tooling and equipment. New York foreclosures. Increasing. Focus on real estate and precious metals. His grandfather had read about human suffering and seen business opportunities, had tracked the spread of economic devastation like a general studying battlefield maps, and he'd positioned himself perfectly, traveling from city to city, always with cash, always ready to buy from people who had no other options. Marcus stood and walked the full perimeter of the chamber, forcing himself to take inventory, to understand the full scope of what he'd inherited. Conservative estimates, based on what he could see and what he knew about current values, put the remaining contents at well over $200 million, maybe more. Much of what his grandfather had accumulated had already been converted and used, but what remained was still staggering. Gold and silver alone probably accounted for $50 million. Currency and bonds, another $75 million. Artwork, antiquities, rare coins, gemstones, the rest, $267 million. That was his inheritance. Not a pile of worthless rocks like his siblings had thought, but a fortune that dwarfed everything they'd received. Combined, his father had known, had always known, and he'd chosen to give this to Marcus, the son who'd walked away from the family, the one who'd rejected the Hayden name and everything it stood for. Why? Marcus pulled out his father's letter and read it again by the light of his flashlight. If I failed you as a father, and I know I did, perhaps I can at least give you this. The truth about where we really came from and what we really built our fortune on. Your grandfather saved this family. I protected his secret. Now it's yours to do with as you see fit. Do with as you see fit. His father was giving him a choice. Keep the fortune, use it, become wealthier than his siblings could imagine, or expose it, reveal the truth about how the Hayden Empire was really built, destroy the family's reputation and legacy, or something else entirely, something Marcus couldn't yet see. He walked back through the rows of crates, his mind spinning. This wasn't just about money. It was about truth, about whether the ends justified the means, about whether you could build something good on a foundation of exploitation. His grandfather had thought so, had believed that survival required doing what others were too weak or too moral to do. His father had accepted that logic, had used the blood money to build Hayden Industries, had employed thousands, had become a pillar of the community. But Marcus, he'd spent 20 years in the mountains precisely because he didn't believe in that kind of compromise. He'd walked away from family wealth because he valued integrity over success. And now, ironically, he'd been given a fortune built on the exact opposite of everything he believed in. His siblings had inherited clean money, legitimate wealth. He'd inherited the family's original sin, hidden and preserved and passed down like a dark heirloom. Marcus climbed back up to the main hall of the fortress and stepped outside into the fading afternoon light. The mountains were turning purple with dusk, and the air smelled of pine and approaching winter. He sat on the stone steps and tried to process what he'd found. $267 million, hidden for 70 years. A secret that would destroy his family if it came out, but a fortune that could transform his life if he kept it hidden. He thought about his siblings, about RJ's smirk and Victoria's contempt and Thomas's dismissive nod. They thought they'd gotten everything, while Marcus had gotten garbage. They had no idea what really lay beneath this fortress. His father had made sure of that, had protected them from the truth while burdening Marcus with it. Was that cruelty or mercy? As darkness fell, Marcus made a decision. He needed time to think, to understand, to figure out what the right thing was. He sealed the steel door again, carefully concealing the entrance, and returned to the main hall. Tomorrow, he'd continue his exploration. There were more documents to read, more journals to find, more pieces of the puzzle to assemble. His grandfather had left breadcrumbs, clues about what had really happened during those dark years. And his father's final words echoed in Marcus's mind. You'll know what to do when you find it. Would he? Marcus wasn't sure. But one thing was certain. His life had changed in ways he was only beginning to comprehend. The mountain man, the family failure, the one who'd walked away from it all, he now held the key to destroying or saving the Hayden legacy. And in the morning, he'd begin figuring out which path to choose. Marcus returned to the fortress at dawn, unable to stay away. The previous night, he'd lain awake in his cabin, his mind replaying everything he'd seen in that underground chamber. $267 million in Depression-era spoils, carefully catalogued and preserved. But as he descended the hidden staircase again, flashlight in hand, he realized he'd only scratched the surface. There was more to discover, more to understand, about why his father had given this burden specifically to him. The steel door opened more easily this time, the hinges loosening with use. Marcus stepped into the vast chamber, and immediately noticed something he'd missed in yesterday's shock and horror. At the far end of the room, past all the crates and shelving units, there was another door, smaller, wooden, with a brass handle that gleamed even in the dim light. How had he missed it? He approached slowly, his boots echoing on the stone floor. The door was locked, but the key from Morrison's folder, the same one that had opened the fortress itself, slid into this lock as well. Inside was a room within a room, perhaps 15 feet square, lined entirely with shelves, and on those shelves were letters, hundreds of them, organized chronologically in leather binders, each one labeled by year. Marcus pulled down the first binder, marked 1929 to 1931, and opened it. The letters inside were in his grandfather's handwriting, but these weren't business correspondence. These were personal. Letters written but never sent. A private record of Jonathan Hayden's thoughts during the worst years of American history. October 30th, 1929. The first letter began. The market collapsed yesterday. Fortunes evaporated in hours. Men I knew, respected men, successful men, they're ruined. Some are already talking about suicide. I should feel sympathy, but all I feel is opportunity. I've been poor twice in my life, and both times it was because I trusted the system, believed in the fairness of markets and the honor of institutions. Never again. This crash is my chance to rebuild, not by following the rules, but by exploiting the chaos. Marcus felt cold reading those words. His grandfather had seen the greatest economic catastrophe in modern history, and his first thought had been opportunity. The letter continued, I have liquid capital, about $45,000, hidden in various safe deposits across 3 states. While banks are failing and credit is frozen, I have cash. Real, spendable cash. I can buy anything I want from people who have no other options. The key is to move quickly, before the government stabilizes things, before other vultures realize what's possible. The next letters documented Jonathan's strategy. He traveled from city to city, reading bankruptcy notices, attending estate sales, visiting families in distress. November 15th, 1929. 1. Letter read. Acquired the entire contents of the Brennan estate in Philadelphia today. The widow was desperate, 3 children to feed, no income, no prospects. I paid her $800 for items worth at least $20,000. She cried when I handed her the cash, thanked me for saving her family. I should have felt guilty. I felt nothing but satisfaction. Marcus's hands shook as he turned pages. Letter after letter documented acquisitions, each one a small tragedy converted into profit. But what made his stomach turn was the clinical detachment in his grandfather's writing. These weren't confessions or expressions of guilt. They were calculations, strategies, notes on improving his efficiency at extracting value from human suffering. March 4th, 1930. Another letter. I've refined my approach. I target families before they reach complete desperation, when they still have dignity, when they're most likely to accept low offers rather than face public auction or complete loss. I dress well, speak respectfully, offer cash immediately. Most people don't understand the true value of what they're selling. They just need money for next month's rent, next week's food. I'm providing a service, really, giving them immediate liquidity in an illiquid market. Marcus set the binder down and reached for another, this one marked 1933 to 1935. The letters here were different, more focused on logistics and storage. His grandfather had accumulated so much that he needed a plan for concealment. July 12, 1933. One entry read, I've purchased the Montana land. Remote, defensible, perfect, for what I need. I'll build a fortress there, something that looks like an eccentric rich man's folly, but underneath, a vault that can preserve everything until the time is right. The key is patience. I can't liquidate too quickly or I'll attract attention, drive down prices. I need to wait, maybe decades, and let the economy recover. Then, slowly, carefully, I'll convert these assets into legitimate wealth. But it was the next binder that changed everything Marcus thought he knew about his family. This one was marked 1956 to 1972, and it contained correspondence between Jonathan and Marcus's father, Richard. Real letters this time, not unsent musings, but actual exchanges between father and son. June 20th, 1956, Richard had written in his careful, precise hand, "Father, I've seen the chamber. I understand now where our family's wealth truly originated. I'm struggling with this knowledge. You taught me to value honesty and integrity, yet you built our fortune on exploitation. How do I reconcile these things? How do I look at our business, our success, knowing it's rooted in the suffering of thousands?" Jonathan's response was clipped and unapologetic. "Richard, you're thinking like a child. The world doesn't reward integrity. It rewards strength, timing, and the courage to act when others hesitate. I gave you opportunities those depression families never had, because I was willing to do what they weren't. You can wallow in guilt, or you can use what I've built to create something meaningful. That's how you reconcile it, by making the sacrifice worth something." The next letters showed Richard slowly, reluctantly, accepting his father's logic. August 3rd, 1956, Richard wrote, "You're right. I can't change the past. But I can use the resources you've accumulated to build something that employs people, that creates value, that contributes to society. Hayden Industries will be my redemption for your sins." Marcus's throat tightened. His father had known everything from age 24, had known and had chosen to use the tainted money anyway, convincing himself that good ends could justify terrible means. But there was more. Marcus kept reading, and what he found next made his blood run cold. November 2nd, 1971, Jonathan had written to Richard, "I'm getting old, and we need to discuss succession. You have 4 children. RJ is ambitious but reckless. Victoria is intelligent but vain. Thomas is capable but lacks vision. And then there's Marcus, the youngest. He's different from the others. He builds things with his hands. He understands value beyond price tags. He's the only one with the character to handle the truth when the time comes." Richard's response, "Father, Marcus is only 18 and already talking about leaving. He doesn't fit with the family, doesn't understand business, doesn't want any part of what we've built. Why would you think he's the right choice?" Jonathan's reply was prophetic. "Because he's the only one who isn't corrupted by the wealth yet. The others have grown up comfortable, entitled. They take everything for granted. Marcus questions, resists, chooses his own path. That independence, that integrity, it's exactly what will be needed when someone has to decide what to do with our secret. When I'm gone, when you're gone, someone will have to choose whether to continue the lie or expose the truth. It has to be someone who values truth over comfort. That's Marcus." Marcus sat on the stone floor, the letters spread around him, and felt tears burning in his eyes. His grandfather had understood him better than his own father had seen in the rebellious teenager something his father had missed. And his father, in the end, had honored that judgment, had given Marcus the inheritance that mattered most. Not money, but choice. But there was more still. Marcus found another section of letters. These marked confidential family matters. And what he read there shattered everything he thought he knew about his siblings. March 17th, 1998. Richard had written in a letter addressed to no one. Another unsent confession, added to his father's collection. "Victoria came to me today asking about father's fortress. She'd been researching property records, found the deed, wanted to know if there was anything valuable there. I told her it was just an old building, worthless, Not worth the drive. But she knows I'm hiding something. I can see it in her eyes. The next letter, dated 2 years later, RJ hired a private investigator to look into father's Depression-era activities. The investigator found records of purchases, estate acquisitions, bankruptcy sales. RJ came to me with the file, asking if father had hidden assets somewhere. I denied everything, told him father had sold everything decades ago to fund the company. He didn't believe me, but he dropped it. For now. Marcus's hands clenched. His siblings had known. Maybe not the full truth, but they'd suspected. They'd been searching, quietly, carefully, trying to find what they thought was their birthright. And his father had protected the secret from them, had lied to them, because he didn't trust them with the truth. June 8, 2003. Another letter. Thomas discovered the existence of the hidden chamber through some old architectural documents he found in father's papers. He came to me directly, said he knew there was something under the fortress, demanded I tell him what. I had to bring him here. I had no choice. I showed him part of the chamber, maybe 20% of what's really there, told him it was mostly documents and a few family heirlooms. He wanted to liquidate everything immediately. I refused. We argued for 3 hours. Finally, I told him that per father's wishes, the fortress and its contents were designated for Marcus, and there was nothing he could do about it. He was furious. Called Marcus every name you can imagine. Said I was throwing away family wealth on a son who'd abandoned us. Marcus felt something crack inside his chest. Thomas knew, had known for years, had seen part of the fortune and been told he couldn't have it. No wonder he'd barely acknowledged Marcus at the funeral. The dismissive nod, the quick return to his documents, it had all been barely contained rage. September 22nd, 2007. Richard's final letter on the subject. They're all searching now. Victoria hired genealogists to research father's activities. RJ has his people investigating property records across 6 states. Thomas is reviewing every legal document father ever signed. They know something exists. They know I'm protecting it, and they're trying to find a way to claim it before I die. But they won't. I've made sure of that. The deed is in Marcus's name, transferred 5 years ago, hidden in a trust they don't know exists. When I'm gone, Marcus will inherit the fortress, and he'll make the decision I never had the courage to make. Whether to expose our family's original sin or perpetuate it for another generation. Marcus stood slowly, his legs shaky, and walked back through the chamber. He looked at the crates with new eyes. This wasn't just a fortune hidden by one man. This was a family secret that had poisoned 3 generations. His grandfather had built it on exploitation. His father had hidden it out of shame and fear. And his siblings, they'd been circling like sharks for years, knowing something valuable existed, but unable to find it, unable to claim it. And now, it was his. All of it. The money, the guilt, the choice. He returned to the smaller room and found one final binder. This one marked simply, "For Marcus." Inside was a single letter in his father's handwriting, written just 3 months before his death. Marcus, if you're reading this, then you've found everything. The chamber, the fortune, the letters, the truth. I know you hate me. You have every right to. I was a terrible father to you, cold and distant and disapproving. But I need you to understand why. When I was 24, my father showed me what he'd built, and it destroyed something in me. I knew our family's success was rooted in the suffering of thousands. I knew I was benefiting from exploitation, and I knew I lacked the courage to give it all up, to start over with nothing, to be poor and honest rather than rich and guilty. The letter continued. You were different from your brothers and sister from the day you were born. You questioned everything, valued what was real over what was expensive, chose integrity over comfort. I saw in you the son I wished I'd been, the one who would have told my father no, who would have walked away from tainted money. But I couldn't let you know about the fortune while you were young, because I was afraid you'd do exactly that. You'd expose everything, destroy the family name, cost thousands of people their jobs when Hayden Industries collapsed under the scandal. Marcus's vision blurred with tears. His father had pushed him away, had made him feel worthless, not because he was disappointed in Marcus, but because he'd been trying to protect him from this burden, from this knowledge that had poisoned his own soul. "So, I made you hate me," Richard wrote. "I pushed you away, made you choose the mountains over the family, let you build a life free from the guilt that consumed me. And then, when I knew I was dying, I put everything in motion to give you what I never had, a choice. Not a choice made under pressure from family or business or social expectations, but a real choice, made alone, with time to think, with all the facts. You can keep the fortune, use it, build something good with tainted money, like I tried to do. You can expose it, let the truth destroy our family's reputation, but clear your conscience. Or, you can do something I never imagined, something only you would think of. Whatever you choose, know this: I was proud of you, every day, for having the strength to leave, the integrity to stay away, the character to live by your own values. You were always the best of us, Marcus. I just wish I'd told you before it was too late." The letter was signed simply, Dad, not Richard, or Father, but Dad, and beneath it was a postscript. P.S. Your siblings will come for you eventually. They've been searching for years. RJ has his investigators. Victoria has her researchers. Thomas has his lawyers. They don't know exactly what's here, but they know it's valuable, and they believe they're entitled to it. Be ready. They won't give up easily. The fortress is legally yours, but they'll fight. I'm sorry to leave you with this battle, but I couldn't think of another way to give you the truth without giving them the power to take it from you. Marcus folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket. He walked back through the chamber one more time, really seeing it now. Not just crates and coins and artifacts, but evidence. Evidence of his grandfather's ruthlessness. Evidence of his father's complicity. Evidence of a family built on a foundation of exploitation and lies. And evidence, too, of his father's final act of love, trusting Marcus with the truth and the freedom to choose what came next. He climbed back up to the main hall of the fortress as afternoon light slanted through the narrow windows. He thought about his siblings, about how they'd laughed when he'd inherited the fortress, how Victoria had smirked, how RJ had looked at him with pity, how Thomas had dismissed him without a word. They'd thought they were looking at failure, at the family loser getting scraps, but what they'd really been looking at was their father's final judgment, that Marcus and Marcus alone could be trusted with the family's darkest secret. He wondered how long it would take them to figure it out. His father had died just a week ago. The estate was still being settled. They were still celebrating their inheritances, their millions in stocks and properties and portfolios. But eventually, maybe in weeks, maybe in months, they'd start asking questions. Why had their father given Marcus the fortress? What was so important about a crumbling stone building in the middle of nowhere? And when they started asking questions, they'd start searching. Victoria with her genealogists and researchers, RJ with his corporate investigators, Thomas with his legal expertise and access to records. They'd piece it together eventually, just like they'd been trying to do for years. And when they realized what Marcus had, they'd come for him. They'd bring lawyers and lawsuits and family pressure. They'd claim he'd manipulated their dying father. They'd argue he was mentally incompetent to manage such wealth. They'd do whatever it took to get what they believed was rightfully theirs. Marcus stepped outside and looked at the surrounding mountains, solid and eternal. His whole life, he'd run from family drama, from conflict, from the messy complications of the Hayden name. He'd built his cabin in the wilderness, specifically to avoid all of that. But now, the drama had found him anyway, delivered in the form of an inheritance he'd never wanted, and a burden he couldn't escape. He thought about his options. He could sell everything secretly, convert it to cash, disappear even deeper into the mountains, where no one would ever find him. But that felt like cowardice, like running from the truth rather than facing it. He could give it all back, deed the fortress to his siblings, let them discover the chamber themselves, and deal with the moral implications. But that felt like betrayal, like disrespecting his father's final wishes and his grandfather's desperate attempt to secure his family's future. Or he could do what his father had hoped he'd do, make a choice that was uniquely his own. Not his grandfather's ruthlessness, not his father's complicity, not his siblings' greed. Something else. Something that honored the victims without destroying the living. Something that acknowledged the past without being enslaved by it. Marcus sat on the stone steps of the fortress as the sun began to set, painting the valley in shades of gold and purple. He pulled out his father's letter and read it again, focusing on one line. "You can do something I never imagined. Something only you would think of." What would that be? What option existed that no one else had considered? He thought about the ledgers in the chamber, the careful records his grandfather had kept, every acquisition documented, every name recorded, every item catalogued. It was evidence, but it was also something else. A map to every family his grandfather had exploited, every estate he'd stripped, every heirloom he'd acquired for pennies. Most of those families were probably gone now, scattered or deceased. But maybe not all of them. Maybe there were descendants, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren who'd grown up hearing stories about how their family had lost everything during the Depression. What if Marcus could find them? What if he could return things that had been taken? Not the money. That was too complicated, too many generations removed. But the personal items, the wedding rings and pocket watches, and photograph albums, the things that had sentimental value beyond price. What if he could give those back, could acknowledge what his grandfather had done, could offer some small measure of justice even after 70 years? It wouldn't absolve the family. It wouldn't erase the exploitation. But it would be something, an acknowledgement, an apology, a small attempt at making right what had been made wrong so long ago. And maybe, just maybe, it would free Marcus from the burden of carrying his family's sins alone. He stood up, decision crystallizing in his mind. He wouldn't keep the fortune, but he wouldn't expose it either. Not yet. Not in a way that would destroy thousands of innocent jobs at Hayden Industries. He'd do something more complicated, more difficult, more true to who he was. He'd spend the next months, maybe years, going through every record in that chamber. He'd identify families, track down descendants, return what could be returned. He'd set up a foundation, anonymous, quiet, that would channel money to communities that had been devastated by the Depression. He'd find a way to convert exploitation into restoration, not perfectly, never perfectly, but intentionally. And when he was done, when he'd done everything he could to make amends, then he'd decide what to tell his siblings, what to tell the world, what legacy the Hayden name would finally carry. It wouldn't be easy. His siblings would fight him. The legal complications would be enormous. The emotional toll would be devastating. But Marcus had spent 20 years in the mountains, learning that the hard path was often the right path, that integrity mattered more than comfort, that you couldn't run from who you were, only choose what to do with it. As darkness fell over the valley, Marcus locked the fortress and walked to his truck. He didn't look back. Tomorrow, he'd return and begin the real work of exploring his inheritance. Not the monetary value, but the human cost. He'd read every name in those ledgers. He'd trace every acquisition. He'd understand, fully and completely, what his grandfather had done. And then, step by step, He'd begin the long process of answering the question his father had left him with. What do you do when you inherit a fortune built on other people's suffering? Marcus didn't have all the answers yet, but he had time, and he had a choice, and he had something his grandfather and father never had: the freedom to define his own path forward, regardless of what his family expected or demanded or believed he deserved. The mountain man, the family failure, the forgotten son, he'd been given the most valuable inheritance of all: the truth and the power to decide what to do with it. And unlike his ancestors, Marcus wasn't going to waste it on secrets and silence. He was going to use it to finally, after 70 years, let the light in. Marcus spent 3 weeks cataloging everything in the chamber before his siblings found out. 3 weeks of solitary work, photographing documents, creating spreadsheets, tracing family names through old census records, and newspaper archives. He'd set up a workspace in one of the fortress's second-floor rooms, running off the generator, working by lamplight until his eyes burned. He was so focused on the research that he didn't hear the vehicles approaching until they were already in the courtyard. He looked out the window and felt his stomach drop. 2 black SUVs and a Mercedes sedan, all parked in a semicircle facing the fortress entrance. He recognized the Mercedes. It was RJ's, the same one he'd been driving at the funeral. Marcus watched as all 3 of his siblings climbed out, followed by 2 men in expensive suits carrying briefcases. Lawyers, almost certainly. Victoria wore designer sunglasses, despite the overcast sky. Thomas had his phone pressed to his ear. RJ stood with his arms crossed, staring at the fortress like he was calculating its value per square foot. Marcus took a deep breath and walked downstairs. He stepped out onto the stone steps just as RJ started toward the door. His brother stopped when he saw him, and something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe, or annoyance that Marcus was actually here. "Marcus," RJ said, his voice carrying that familiar tone of forced politeness that barely masked contempt. "We need to talk." "About what?" Marcus asked, though he knew exactly what. Victoria pulled off her sunglasses, and her expression was ice. "Don't play stupid. We know, Marcus. We know what's in this building. You know there's a building," Marcus said carefully. "That's all the will gave me. A building and some land." Thomas stepped forward, and his face was harder than Marcus had ever seen it. "We know about the chamber. We know Dad hid something here. And we know you've been coming here every day for 3 weeks, which means you found it." Marcus's heart pounded, but he kept his expression neutral. "How did you figure it out? Does it matter?" RJ snapped. "Dad left you a fortress worth nothing, while the 3 of us split the actual estate. That never made sense. So, we started looking into why." Victoria found grandfather's journals at Dad's house, the ones he kept in his office safe. Thomas found architectural plans that showed irregularities in the foundation, and I paid a structural engineer to do a ground-penetrating radar scan of this entire property. He pointed at the fortress. "There's a massive cavity under this building, Marcus. 40 feet by 60 feet, carved from solid granite. Now, are you going to tell us what's down there, or are we going to have to involve the courts?" Marcus looked at his siblings, really looked at them, and saw the greed naked on their faces. Not curiosity, not concern about family history, just the desperate hunger of people who believed they'd been cheated out of something valuable. He thought about his father's warning. "They'll come for you. They won't give up easily." "There's a chamber," Marcus admitted. "Grandfather built it. And yes, there are items stored there." "What kind of items?" Victoria demanded. Dad's journals mentioned acquisitions, Depression-era assets. "Are we talking about money? Artwork? What?" Marcus hesitated. He could lie, could minimize, could try to protect them from the truth a little longer. But his father had spent 40 years lying, and it had poisoned him. Marcus wouldn't make the same mistake. About $267 million worth of Depression-era acquisitions, he said quietly. Gold, silver, currency, bonds, artwork, antiquities, gemstones. Grandfather bought it all between 1929 and 1936, hid it here, and slowly liquidated it to fund Hayden Industries. The silence that followed was absolute. Victoria's face went pale. Thomas's jaw dropped. RJ just stared, his expression cycling through disbelief, rage, and calculation in rapid succession. 200, RJ finally said, his voice strangled. $67 million. Give or take, Marcus said. I haven't had it professionally appraised. Yet. And Dad left it all to you, Victoria said, her voice rising with each word. He left us millions in stocks and property, legitimate wealth, and he gave you, the son who abandoned the family, who rejected everything we built, he gave you a secret fortune worth more than everything else combined. It's not that simple, Marcus started, but Thomas cut him off. Not that simple? Marcus, that's our inheritance. That's family wealth that should be divided equally among all four of us. What Dad did, giving it all to you, that's not legal. We can fight this. On what grounds? Marcus asked. Dad was mentally competent when he wrote the will. He had every right to distribute his property however he wanted. One of the lawyers, a sharp-faced man with silver hair, stepped forward. Actually, if it can be proven that your father engaged in fraud or undue influence, or if you manipulated him during his final illness, we can challenge the bequest. And given the amount involved, I'd say we have strong motivation to explore every legal avenue. Marcus felt anger rising in his chest. I didn't manipulate anyone. I hadn't spoken to Dad in 4 years before the funeral. He made his decision without any input from me. Then why you? Victoria's voice cracked with fury and something that sounded almost like pain. Why would he do this to us? We stayed. We were loyal. We built the business with him. You ran away to play mountain man, and he rewards you with a fortune because he trusted me to do the right thing, Marcus said quietly. The right thing? RJ laughed, harsh and bitter. The right thing is to share it. 4 ways, equal parts, like it should have been from the beginning. You want to do the right thing, Marcus. Then open that chamber, show us what's inside, and let's settle this like adults. Marcus looked at his brother, at the desperation barely concealed behind the anger, and made a choice. Fine, I'll show you. But you need to understand something first. What's down there? It's not just money. It's evidence of how our family really made its fortune. And once you see it, once you know the truth, you won't be able to unknow it. Stop being dramatic and open the damn chamber, Thomas said. Marcus led them inside, through the main hall, to the hidden staircase. He showed them the trigger stone, watched their faces as the wall swung open to reveal the passage below. They descended in silence, the lawyers staying behind. And when Marcus opened the steel door, he heard Victoria gasp. The work lights he'd strung throughout the chamber illuminated everything clearly. Rows of crates stacked with military precision, shelving units loaded with boxes and containers, the filing cabinets, the platforms with their canvas-covered treasures. RJ moved forward like a man in a trance, his hand reaching out to touch the nearest crate. It's real, he whispered. It's all real. Victoria walked to one of the filing cabinets and pulled open a drawer. Inside were the ledgers, the careful records of every acquisition. She pulled one out and began reading, her expression changing as she turned pages. Thomas was examining the crates, doing mental calculations, his lawyer's mind already working through the implications. Marcus watched them discover what he'd discovered, watched the initial excitement give way to something darker as they began to understand what they were really looking at. Victoria set down the ledger she'd been reading, her face pale. These are foreclosure records, estate liquidations. He bought these things from people who'd lost everything, During the Depression, Marcus said, when people were desperate, when banks were failing, when families were starving, grandfather positioned himself to profit from the worst economic disaster in American history. But that's just business, RJ said, though his voice lacked conviction. Buying low, selling high. That's how markets work. Read the ledgers, Marcus said. Really, read them. Look at what he paid versus what things were worth. Look at the notes he made about sellers' desperation. This wasn't business. It was exploitation. Thomas had found the room with the letters. He came out, holding one of the binders, his face troubled. Dad knew. He knew from the beginning. He looked at Marcus. Did you know? Is that why he gave this to you? Because you already knew about the chamber? I didn't know anything until I read Dad's letter, Marcus said. He left me a letter, explaining everything. Why grandfather built the fortress, how he used the hidden fortune to fund Hayden Industries, and why he chose to give it to me, instead of any of you. Why? Victoria's voice was sharp. Why you, Marcus? What made you so special? Marcus pulled the letter from his jacket and handed it to her. Read it yourself, all of you. Then we'll talk about what happens next. They passed the letter between them, reading in silence. Marcus watched their expressions change as they absorbed their father's words, his confession, his reasoning, his final act of trust. When they finished, Victoria's hands were shaking. Thomas looked like he'd been punched. RJ's face was unreadable, closed off in that way he had when emotions threatened to overwhelm his carefully maintained control. He thought we were corrupted, Victoria finally said, her voice hollow. He thought we were too greedy, too entitled, too weak to handle the truth. He thought you were human, Marcus corrected gently. He thought you'd grown up with wealth and comfort, and that made it harder to see the cost of that wealth. He thought I might be able to see it clearly because I'd chosen to live without it. So what? RJ's voice was hard. We're just supposed to accept that you get everything? That Dad's moral judgment means we lose out on our share of the family fortune? You got your share, Marcus said. You got millions in legitimate wealth. What's down here? This isn't legitimate. This is blood, money. This is the price of other people's suffering. That's very noble, Marcus, Thomas said, and there was an edge to his voice. But you don't get to make that decision unilaterally. That fortune, morally complicated or not, is part of our family's estate. We have a legal right to contest its distribution. Go ahead, Marcus said quietly. Take me to court. Fight for your share of grandfather's exploitation. But know that if you do, everything comes out. Every ledger, every letter, every acquisition record. The world will know exactly how the Hayden fortune was really built. Hayden Industries, the family name, Dad's reputation, all of it gets destroyed in the process. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. RJ turned away, his shoulders tense. Victoria pressed her fingers to her temples like she had a headache. Thomas just stared at Marcus with an expression that might have been respect or might have been hatred. It was hard to tell. So you're blackmailing us, RJ finally said. Accept our exclusion or watch our family's name get destroyed in court. I'm giving you a choice, Marcus corrected. The same choice Dad gave me. You can fight for money that will cost you everything else, or you can walk away and let me handle this my way. And what is your way? Victoria asked. Keep it all for yourself? Live like a king while we pretend to be satisfied with our millions? Marcus shook his head. I don't want it. Any of it. What I want is to use it, to make things right. As much as that's possible. 70 years later. He explained his plan, the research he'd been doing, the families he'd been tracing, the idea of returning personal items, and establishing a foundation for communities devastated by the Depression. As he talked, he watched their faces, seeing different reactions. Thomas looked thoughtful, his legal mind working through the implications. Victoria seemed torn between anger and something that might have been admiration. RJ just looked skeptical. "That's insane," RJ said when Marcus finished. "You want to give away $267 million to make amends for something our grandfather did almost a century ago. Not give it away randomly," Marcus said. "Use it intentionally. Return what can be returned. Fund programs that help communities still dealing with generational poverty from the Depression. Make the exploitation mean something besides just making our family rich." "And what about us?" Victoria asked. "What about our say in this?" "Legally, you don't have a say," Marcus said. "Dad made sure of that. The fortress and everything in it is mine, free and clear. But morally, you're right. This is family wealth, family sin, family responsibility. So I'm asking, not telling. Will you support what I'm trying to do? Or are you going to fight me?" The question hung in the air. Marcus could see them processing, calculating, weighing their options. Finally, Thomas spoke up. "If we agree to this, to your plan, what do we get? Besides keeping the family name clean, what's in it for us?" "Peace," Marcus said simply. "The ability to live without this burden. Without having to know that every dollar you spend, every success you celebrate, it's built on other people's suffering. I'm offering to carry that weight so you don't have to." "How noble," RJ said sarcastically. "Saint Marcus, sacrificing himself for the family." "It's not about nobility," Marcus shot back, anger finally breaking through. "It's about doing what Dad couldn't do, what grandfather refused to do, taking responsibility, making a choice that isn't just about protecting ourselves or accumulating more, actually trying to make something right that's been wrong for 3 generations." Victoria walked to one of the crates and ran her hand across its surface. "I found records," she said quietly, "of grandfather buying jewelry from families in my research. One entry was about a woman named Victoria Morrison, my namesake. She sold her wedding ring and her grandmother's pearls to him in 1932. She got $43. The items were worth over $2,000. I'm named after a woman grandfather exploited." Marcus saw something shift in his sister's face, a crack in the anger, a glimpse of the person underneath the polish and pride. "Then help me," he said to her. "To all of them. Help me find the descendants of Victoria Morrison and the thousands of others. Help me turn this chamber from a monument to greed into a tool for restoration." "And if we refuse?" Thomas asked. "If we fight you in court, then we all lose," Marcus said. "You lose your reputation. I lose any chance of making this right quietly. And the family's grandfather hurt. They lose again because everything will be tied up in litigation for years, while lawyers get rich, and nothing actually changes." RJ turned back to face them, and Marcus could see him doing the math, weighing the costs and benefits like the businessman he was. "Let me get this straight. You want us to walk away from any claim to this fortune, support your crusade to give it all away, and in exchange we get, what? A clear conscience? The satisfaction of watching you play Robin Hood with family assets. You get to not be villains," Marcus said bluntly. "You get to be part of the solution instead of part of the problem. And you get to choose that, deliberately, which is more than Dad ever got to do." The argument continued for another 2 hours. They moved back up to the main hall, the lawyers were called in, and everyone had opinions. The attorneys argued about legal precedents and fiduciary responsibility. Victoria wavered between anger and reluctant acceptance. Thomas kept asking detailed questions about Marcus's plan, poking holes, suggesting improvements. And RJ, predictably, kept returning to the money, to what they were giving up, to the unfairness of it all. But slowly, gradually, something shifted. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the weight of the truth, now that they'd seen it with their own eyes. Maybe it was the realization that Marcus wasn't going to back down, and fighting him would cost more than it would gain. Whatever the reason, by the time the sun began to set, they'd reached an uneasy agreement. R.J., Victoria, and Thomas would not contest the will. They would not claim any portion of the chamber's contents. In exchange, Marcus would establish a family foundation, with all 4 siblings on the board, that would oversee the distribution of the hidden assets. Every decision would require unanimous agreement, every expenditure would be documented and transparent, and if Marcus ever tried to use the fortune for personal gain, the others could remove him and take control. It wasn't trust, exactly. It was a contract, a legal framework for cooperation among people who didn't particularly like each other, but recognized they were stuck together. The lawyers drew up preliminary documents on their laptops, right there in the fortress, using the generator to power their equipment, and by midnight, everyone had signed. As his siblings prepared to leave, Victoria paused at the door. "I still think you're insane," she said to Marcus. "But maybe Dad was right about you. Maybe you are the only one of us who could do this." "I'm not doing it alone," Marcus said. "I can't. This is too big, too complicated. I need your research skills, Victoria, your connections. If we're going to find these families, trace these stories, we need someone who knows how to dig through historical records." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded, slowly. "I'll think about it." Thomas shook Marcus's hand at the door, a formal gesture that carried surprising weight. "I'll have my firm handle the legal structure pro bono," he said. "Make sure everything is airtight. You're taking on something massive, little brother. Don't screw it up." RJ was the last to leave. He stood in the courtyard, looking back at the fortress, and his expression was unreadable. "You know what the funny thing is?" he said. "I spent my whole life trying to live up to Dad's expectations, trying to prove I was worthy of the Hayden name. And you spent your whole life running from it. But in the end, he trusted you with the truth and gave me the lie." He shook his head. "I'm not sure if I respect you or hate you for that." "You can do both," Marcus said. "I'm still figuring out how I feel about it myself." After they left, Marcus sat alone in the fortress as darkness settled over the valley. He thought about his father, about the burden he'd carried in silence for 43 years. Richard Hayden had known what his company was built on, had used tainted money to create something legitimate, and had lived every day with the weight of that compromise. Now Marcus understood why his father had been so hard, so distant, so difficult. He'd been protecting them all from a truth that had slowly poisoned him from the inside. The weeks that followed were a blur of activity. Marcus moved his base of operations from his cabin to the fortress, setting up a proper workspace with internet, computers, and filing systems. Victoria, true to her word, came back and brought her research team. Together, they began the painstaking work of identifying victims and tracing descendants. They found Morrison families in 6 states, descendants of people who'd sold everything to Jonathan Hayden. They found Chens and Rodriguez's and O'Malley's, families who'd lost heirlooms during the Depression and never recovered. They found photographs in old newspapers of foreclosure sales where Jonathan had been present, his face sometimes visible in the background, watching, waiting, calculating. And slowly, quietly, they began making contact. Not all at once, not publicly, but carefully, personally. A letter would arrive at someone's door. "Your great-grandmother sold a pocket watch to my grandfather in 1932. I've located the watch. I'd like to return it to your family." Sometimes people responded with gratitude, sometimes with suspicion. Sometimes they didn't respond at all. But Marcus kept going, methodically working through the ledgers, returning what could be returned. A wedding ring mailed to a woman in Ohio who'd heard stories her whole life about her grandmother's lost jewelry. A collection of photographs restored to a family in Detroit who'd thought their history was gone forever. A silver tea service driven personally to an elderly man in Pennsylvania who broke down crying when he saw it. remembering his mother's stories about the day she'd been forced to sell it. Thomas set up the legal structure, creating the Hayden Foundation for Economic Recovery and Historical Restitution. It was a mouthful of a name, but it described exactly what they were doing, trying to address, however inadequately, the economic devastation of the Depression and restore what had been taken. The foundation would fund education programs in communities that had never recovered from the 1930s. It would support historical research into Depression-era exploitation. It would create scholarships for descendants of families who'd lost everything. RJ, surprisingly, turned out to be useful too. His business connections helped identify institutions that could properly value and preserve the artwork and antiquities. His understanding of markets helped them liquidate assets without flooding markets or attracting unwanted attention. He still complained, still made cutting remarks about Marcus's guilt project, but he showed up, and he did the work. 6 months after the reading of the will, Marcus stood in the fortress's main hall, now converted into a proper office and archive. The chamber below was 3/4 empty, its contents catalogued, distributed, sold, or secured for future use. He was working on correspondence, responding to a letter from a woman in California who thought she might be descended from one of the families in his grandfather's ledgers, when his phone rang. It was a reporter from a major newspaper. Somehow, despite their efforts at discretion, word had leaked. People were talking about a mysterious foundation returning Depression-era artifacts. Questions were being asked about where these items had come from, who'd been holding them for 70 years, why they were being returned now. Marcus knew this moment would come. He'd prepared for it, discussed it with his siblings, agreed on a strategy, but still, his heart pounded as he confirmed his identity and agreed to an interview. The truth was going to come out. Not all of it, not the full $267 million figure, but enough to acknowledge that Jonathan Hayden had profited from the Depression, enough to admit that Hayden Industries had been partially funded by exploitation, enough to begin the process of public accountability. The article ran 2 weeks later. Hayden heirs confront family's Depression-era profiteering, the headline read. It was fair, surprisingly balanced, acknowledging both the exploitation and the efforts at restitution. The response was immediate and intense. Some praised the family for taking responsibility. Others condemned them for not doing more, for not giving up everything. Social media erupted with hot takes and virtue signaling, and genuine discussion about generational wealth and historical injustice. Hayden Industries stock took a hit, dropped 15% in a week, as investors worried about the company's reputation. RJ called Marcus in a fury, screaming about shareholder value and public relations disasters. But the stock recovered, and something unexpected happened. Young people, particularly, seemed to respect the honesty, the acknowledgement, the attempt to make things right. Job applications to Hayden Industries increased. The company's reputation, long-term, might actually improve from confronting its past rather than hiding it. Marcus watched it all unfold with a strange sense of detachment. He'd done what his father had asked, made the choice his grandfather and father hadn't been able to make. He'd exposed the truth, taken responsibility, and begun the long process of restitution. It wasn't perfect. It couldn't be. You couldn't undo 70 years of exploitation with letters and returned pocket watches. But it was something. It was honest. It was intentional. 1 year after his father's death, Marcus drove back to his cabin for the first time in months. The place looked exactly as he'd left it, but he felt different. He wasn't the same man who'd split wood here, alone and content in his isolation. He'd been pulled back into the family he'd spent 20 years avoiding, but on his terms, for his reasons. He sat on the porch steps as dusk fell over the mountains and thought about legacy. His grandfather had built a fortune through ruthless exploitation. and hidden it away, believing that success justified any means. His father had inherited that fortune and that burden, using tainted money to build something legitimate, but living in secret shame. And now Marcus, he was building something else entirely. Not wealth hidden in darkness, but truth brought into light. Not exploitation passed down through generations, but accountability accepted and acted upon. It wasn't the legacy any of them had imagined. The family failure, the mountain man, the son who'd rejected everything the Haydens stood for. He'd become the one to redefine what the name meant. Not success at any cost, but integrity despite the cost. Not wealth preserved through silence, but truth told through courage. Marcus pulled out his father's letter, creased and worn from being carried in his pocket for a year, and read the final lines one more time. "You were always the best of us, Marcus. I just wish I'd told you before it was too late." He folded the letter carefully and looked out at the darkening peaks. It wasn't too late. Not entirely. His father had found a way to tell him, had found a way to give him not just wealth, but purpose, choice, the freedom to be better than the generations that came before. And Marcus, standing in the shadow of mountains that had witnessed everything, from his grandfather's desperate construction, to his father's silent guilt, to his own stumbling attempts at justice, Marcus knew he'd done something that mattered. Not perfectly, not completely, but honestly, which was more than the Hayden name had earned in 3 generations. The fortress stood in its valley, no longer a tomb for buried secrets, but a workshop for difficult reconciliation. The chamber beneath it, once filled with $267 million in Depression-era plunder, was now mostly empty, its contents returned or repurposed or converted into tools for restoration. And Marcus, he'd finally found what he'd been searching for in these mountains 20 years ago. Not escape from his family, but a way to transform it. Because in the end, the strongest inheritance isn't money or property or even truth. It's the courage to choose what you do with what you're given, regardless of what your ancestors expected or your siblings demand or the world judges. Marcus had been given a fortress, a fortune, and a burden. He'd chosen to turn them into something his grandfather never imagined and his father never dared. A chance to make the family name mean something worth inheriting. Anyone can inherit wealth, but only the courageous can inherit truth and choose to act on it. As stars emerged over the Montana wilderness, Marcus stood and walked back into his cabin, not to hide, but to rest before tomorrow's work. Because the work of restitution, of transformation, of becoming better than your past, that work never truly ended. It just continued, day after day, choice after choice, until the story of who you were became the story of what you chose to build. And Marcus Hayden, the man who'd inherited $267 million in blood money and turned it into something resembling redemption, he was just getting started. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories are waiting for you. Click to keep discovering with us. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe some inheritances are meant to be transformed, not treasured.